Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Defending the Freedom to Give in 2021. My name is Joanne Florino, and I'm the Adam Meyerson Fellow at the Philanthropy Roundtable. This webinar follows up on the Philanthropic Freedom webinar we offered last August, but today our expert speakers will be looking through a lens that includes some recent events and, of course, takes into account a changed political environment. Protecting philanthropic freedom is a critical component of the Philanthropy Roundtable's mission, and we define it as first, an individual or organization's freedom to exercise human generosity by making voluntary charitable contributions for the sake of the well-being and improvement of society. And second, as an individual or organization's freedom from restriction or coercion in the exercise of such generosity. So our speakers today include Sandra Swirsky, partner at Urban Swirsky & Associates in Washington, D.C., Christina Rasmussen, project lead at the Philanthropy Roundtable, and Christy Herrera, the Roundtable's Vice President of Policy and Government Affairs. I know they all have plenty to say, so let's get started. Sandra, will you please start us off with an overview of the changed political environment for philanthropy?
Sure. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So there's a lot to digest and process right now between the disappointing rollout of the vaccines, surging COVID deaths, and political riots around the country. Hope really isn't coming easy. But focusing on the good people doing good work within our philanthropy community certainly makes all of this easier to bear. I want to thank each of you for being one of those good people. And I'm thankful that you're making this webinar a priority today. So the Georgia election last week shifted the balance of power in Washington. Political power and policy power are now in the hands of the Democratic Party. Typically, we would expect the party in control, Democrats this year, to offer sweeping policy changes and have an unobstructed pathway to enact those new policies into law. That looks a little less likely this year, and that's because of the surprising strength of the Republicans in the House, many of whom flipped blue seats to red, and in the Senate, where many Republicans were successful in keeping their seats. Bottom line is that the Democrats have control of Congress, but by the slimmest of margins. So while talk will be big and no doubt uncomfortable depending on your politics, Congress will likely pass narrower and probably more moderate bills. So what you're probably all thinking is, well, what does this mean for philanthropic freedom? So we saw a copy recently of a letter that incoming Majority Leader Chuck Schumer sent to his Democratic colleagues in the Senate, laying out his agenda for the year. This letter, along with other recent remarks and letters from key Democrats, tell us that Congress will, at some point this year, focus on wealth disparity and, reading between the lines, donor privacy. Let's start with the wealth disparity issue. What Democrats mean when they say we're going to focus on wealth disparity is redistribute wealth through tax increases and new excise taxes and the like. Whether or not they pull in philanthropic assets into the definition of wealth is an open question. Democrats generally view charitable dollars and philanthropic assets as partly public dollars. Why? Well, because they view the charitable deduction and the exemption of a foundation or donor advised fund as government subsidies that convert charitable dollars into public property. And because of those subsidies, the government has the obligation to make sure the public's money is well spent. They do that by regulating, rulemaking, and mandating, which jeopardizes your philanthropic freedom. The Roundtable's perspective is that Congress intended the charitable sector, known as the independent sector, to be generally free from government taxes. So the charitable deduction was really created to eliminate taxes on charitable gifts, fund the independent sector. Whether those gifts go to foundations, donor advised funds, or directly to charity. Likewise, foundations and other charitable vehicles, like donor advised funds, are generally free from tax because of Congress's intent for this sector to be independent. We can also expect incoming fire from a few well-funded sector critics who are gearing up to sell their reform proposals to an eager audience of members of Congress looking to get charitable resources more quickly into the hands of their constituents. Christina's going to drill down into some of these proposals that, given the new power dynamic in Washington, suddenly have a lot more cachet. Before I turn over to Christina for all the good stuff, I want to spend a few moments on donor privacy. Last week's political riots in Washington have appropriately raised a lot of questions about the groups that participated and consequently growing interest in how they're funded. Hearings and investigations into these groups, hearings and investigations into these groups are top of the list for Chuck Schumer's Senate. In the past few days, there's been activity, mostly on social media, about donors that funneled money to these groups, that organized the riots through donor-advised funds and anonymously. When Congress begins hearings on these groups, I think we have to expect that philanthropy and anonymity will be drawn in. So I'm going to leave things there and ask Christina to drill down on all of this and more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And I would like to extend Sandra's gratitude to everyone who's chosen to join us this afternoon. My name is Christina Rasmussen, and I advise the Philanthropy Roundtable with their federal outreach. And our focus today in this webinar is assessing the threats to charitable giving in a period of continued crisis. And after connecting with influencers inside and out of government, as well as from the left and the right, I'd sum up the situation like this. It's a moment of great opportunity as well as great risk for the philanthropic sector. Anytime you have one-party control of government, even narrow one-party control of government, the likelihood of swifter and bolder policymaking goes up significantly. Officials in charge are more likely to find consensus with one another, and they're willing to put in the effort to pass bills if there's a chance to get it past the finish line. But what exactly elected officials find consensus on is key to protecting philanthropic freedom. So let's talk about the good news, the opportunities first. There's more interest than ever in helping Americans assist their neighbors and friends through these very, very trying times. Proposals to incentivize more Americans to participate in charitable giving through expanded and simplified tax benefits are likely to find backers on both sides of the aisle. And how would this happen? Well, Congress is likely to be advancing one or more COVID response bills, as well as an infrastructure bill. There's talk of a tax or economic bill that could be teed up perhaps through the budget reconciliation process, which just makes it a little bit easier to get through the Senate. Within these verticals or moving bills, charitable policy has the potential to be included. Although we should be realistic about how other pent-up policy initiatives, such as income equality or economic intervention measures, could take precedence. There's also the opportunity for government to explicitly recognize and respect the role that the civil sector plays in helping communities recover and move forward. Now let's talk about the risk. And there's a lot of it. And it could manifest itself in the form of reduced freedom for charitable givers. Many of us have had observations about 2020 being a tough year, and it was, but 2021 could hold some serious challenges as well. We saw a jobs report just last week that was very worrisome, with 140,000 jobs lost in December. Charities will be continued to be asked to do a lot, and donors are going to be asked what they can do to make an even greater difference. And there's going to be a tension between stepping up now while remembering that we may have greater needs that eclipse even what we're seeing at this time. And we wouldn't want a situation where increasing payouts in the short term becomes a decrease in grants over the long term, especially if it leaves us unprepared and vulnerable for the next crisis. So some of the threats to philanthropic freedom in 2021 will be carried over from prior years. The Patriotic Millionaires Group, for example, continues to push for higher payout mandates on foundations and donor-advised funds, among many other things. H.R. 1 from the last Congress, should it be renewed, includes provisions for donor disclosure for some 501c groups. And as Sandra mentioned, key senators and representatives, including some who will be in new leadership or chair positions, will want to investigate certain groups and donors. And this could renew policy ideas that have unintended consequences that affect everyone, including groups far outside the initial scrutiny. There are also relatively new pushes to limit philanthropic freedom, especially a legislative proposal coming from John Arnold and Ray Madoff that would make sweeping changes to laws governing charitable giving, particularly donor-advised funds and private foundations. Here are 4 things you should know about this new initiative. 1, under their plan, the Congress would end donor-advised funds as we know them, and instead create a new form of donor-advised funds that would punish donors by withholding tax benefits if they want more than 15 years to distribute funds. This unfortunately sacrificed the needs of tomorrow for the needs of today. Second, the initiative creates winners and losers among charities. While donors would receive full and immediate tax benefits by donating to any other charity, they would not if they donated to a sponsoring organization to set up a donor-advised fund. Third, there's donor privacy concerns. The initiative would prohibit counting DAF contributions toward the 5% payout rule for private foundations. We know that donors use DAFs for off-mission grants, often to controversial causes, and that DAFs protect the privacy and safety of foundation staff, family members, and grantees who could otherwise be the targets of violence or harassment. And finally, there's concerns for family foundations. The plan would prohibit counting family members' salaries or travel toward the 5% payout rule. This creates a system in which your last name matters most, not the mission, not donor intent, not impact, and not value. Quite simply, we're very concerned that the Arnold Madoff initiative would produce a chilling effect on charitable giving, precisely when we should be making it easier for people to find pathways to giving so they can support the causes they care about in a way that works for them. Moving on to the Biden administration, I would also note that the teams are still somewhat of a question mark for the philanthropic community. Janet Yellen, the nominee for the Treasury Department, has focused a lot on deficit policy in the past, and she'll be looking for revenue raisers as part of a tax bill, which the administration could seek to find in the philanthropic sector. The nominee to head the Office of Management and Budget, very important for fiscal matters, herself comes out of a nonprofit organization and has an appreciation of how the charitable giving works, how it works in the real world. So as more political appointments are made up and down the food chain, we're going to get an increasingly better understanding of which voices will ultimately steer administration policy. So, as I said earlier, there's a lot of opportunity, but a lot of risk. And let me wrap up my portion with 3 recommendations on how to best navigate 2021. First, keep your lines of communication wide open with your representatives and senators. They should know exactly how you make a positive difference in your community, and they should understand what donation systems and structures you rely on to make your work possible. Do donor advised funds make a difference to your activities? Is donor privacy crucial to your giving streams? Would new regulatory burdens distract you from the urgent work at hand? How has your giving increased over the past year? And how has the efficacy of your grants improved? I know that you know the answers to these questions, but do your members of Congress? They should. Second, I would recommend that you keep talking to members of both parties. With partisan margins as close as they are in the House and Senate, you'll want allies on both sides of the aisle. You never know when seats change and under what conditions, so it's best to keep an open dialogue with everyone who has a say on your work. Bipartisan coalitions are powerful things, and the great advantage of the sector is that philanthropy has friends across the board. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't encourage you to stay involved with the Philanthropy Roundtable. You have a committed group of individuals working together day in and day out to advance philanthropic freedom on your behalf. You can count on the Philanthropy Roundtable for timely information on ways to make a difference and to protect the freedoms we all cherish. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christina. Christy, I heard Christina mention donor privacy in her remarks. And I'm wondering if you can now tell us what philanthropy may be facing in that area, both federally and in the states.
Sure. And thanks, Joanne. And thanks for all of you for joining us. I want to kind of pick up on something that Christina said, and that is that to me, it is very clear that within the Beltway, at least, there is a very real fear that cancel culture and the worst of cancel culture will soon come to bear for the nonprofit sector. If you've kept up on the news recently, although there's so much going on that makes you want to kind of turn off the news, but if you've been watching the headlines, you might have seen 4 things in this arena that I think will disturb you. The first was a interview in October on MSNBC where Senator Sheldon Whitehouse said, quote, "If we do get to control committees in the Senate, and we have the ability to do real investigations instead of all of the covering up that Republican committees have done, then I think we need to start asking questions like, who wrote a $17 million check to pay for the ad campaigns that helped get Brett Kavanaugh onto the Supreme Court? Second, if you read Politico like I do, you might have seen in last Wednesday's edition an article that discussed Ron Wyden's Senate Finance Chairmanship. And the story said, quote, "Similarly, his oversight focus on the tax-exempt sector, especially increasing donor disclosures and investigating alleged abuses by the National Rifle Association, are likely to remain more partisan than not." Third, and Sandra kind of teed this up at the beginning, Senator Schumer sent a Dear Colleague letter on Tuesday that outlined his priorities for a Democratic Senate, including one of the first acts of incoming Senate Judiciary Chairman Dick Durbin to, quote, "closely examine the rise of violent extremist groups." Now, one thing on this, and I want to make it clear, I think we all agree that what happened at the Capitol last Wednesday was disgusting and heinous, and there weren't enough adjectives to describe how horrible it was. And in my personal opinion, is probably the most recent manifestation of our collective attack on our nation's institutions. But what I'm concerned about here is a slippery slope. It's a slippery slope of organizations who could be swept up in the investigation purely because of their mission or purely because of their guiding principles. And finally, there was an excellent op-ed in the Wall Street Journal today talking about incoming Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra. The op-ed says that no federal agency works as much with nonprofits than HHS. And then it goes on to cite Becerra's previous remarks calling the tax exemption for charitable foundations a $32 billion earmark, and that Americans should have, quote, "an obligation to make sure those $32 billion that would have gone to the federal government are used for a public good." So Christina talked a little bit about HR 1 and the fact that it was reintroduced last week and how that could usher in a sweeping new donor disclosure intended to target and harass donors. Of course, this is all done in the name of transparency. But luckily, right now, you've heard a lot of bad news. I think I can deliver some good news. Joanne asked me to talk about donor privacy in particular, and I want to let all of you know that there may be some relief on the horizon. You might be asking, well, why is that? The good news is that we have the first donor privacy case headed to the Supreme Court in 6 decades. So you all might remember NAACP versus Alabama. It was a landmark case, I think it's 1958, in which the NAACP sued the state of Alabama because it refused to hand over the names and addresses of its members. At the time, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the NAACP, saying that the government cannot force controversial groups to identify their members without a compelling reason to do so. The issue is that in the years since the NAACP ruling, courts have upheld laws that infringe on our right to free association because, to put it kind of simply, those laws fit that compelling reason exemption. But that all changed in 2016. 2016, the Americans for Prosperity Foundation filed a lawsuit against then California Attorney General Kamala Harris, which challenged her requirement that charitable organizations turn over the names and addresses of their donors. Last Friday, the Supreme Court announced that it is going to hear the case in its current term. I think this is fantastic news, and it could have wide-ranging benefits for nonprofits of all stripes. What AFPF is saying here is that there is no compelling interest for the government to have this information, and that the systematic leaks of donors' names and addresses could put those people at risk for very real harm. And this is not just a problem for those on the right. I think it's worth noting that at the time of the lawsuit, California state employees uploaded Schedule B forms, confidential names of donor names and donor addresses for more than 1,800 nonprofit organizations, which affected everyone from Americans for Prosperity to Planned Parenthood. If you follow the Roundtable, you might have seen that we filed an amicus brief last fall. We urged the Supreme Court to take up the case, and we are so happy it did. And the reason why we did that is because we believe that charitable donor privacy is a long-standing and it's a vital part of our free and civil society. We know that donors give privately for a lot of reasons, whether it's part of their faith, maybe they just don't want to be harassed, and that the state does not need the bulk collection of donors' names and addresses and other personal information in order to properly have oversight over these groups. Shifting gears here, while I think it's important that we are engaged in what's going on in Washington, I'd like to talk a little bit about what's unfolding in the states. We are expecting a wide range of attacks on philanthropic freedom in state legislatures across the country, from blue states and red states. Three things to kind of keep in mind here. First, if you joined us for the Roundtable's post-election webinar in November, you might remember me telling you that last year, in 2020, 15 states introduced or considered bills that would require donor disclosure for 501c3 groups. This year, and it's January 14th, 5 states have already introduced similar legislation. They're a mix of red and blue, and most state legislatures haven't even gotten started yet. Second, we are seeing these kinds of larger philosophical attacks at the federal level bubble up now in state capitals. You might remember that during the primaries in the 2020 election, both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren proposed a wealth tax that would have clawed in charitable assets. Well, last year we saw 2 bills filed in the New York legislature that would implement a state version of a wealth tax that would not only have included charitable assets, but also DAF contributions. If you look at how the bill moved, it was filed a little bit too late in the session for it to really go anywhere. So I would not be surprised if that pops up again. We also spent a lot of today's conversation already talking about DAFs. Last year, the California legislature considered a package of bills that would have required DAF sponsors to disclose information about individual accounts, which prompts serious privacy concerns, as well as another bill giving the Attorney General carte blanche in regulating them. We're also hearing a lot of talk from attorneys general about the, quote, supervisory gap around DAFs. Third, and finally, we expect to see more attacks on this notion on whether philanthropy is indeed public or private money. Last summer, the Pennsylvania House considered a resolution that would have initiated a government study on whether nonprofit organizations truly serve the public interest, or if they place, quote, an unfair tax burden on working class residents of this Commonwealth. So Joanne, to wrap it up, it is going to be a tough couple of years.
Thank you so much, Christy, for all of that. I want to take a little break here right now. Someone has asked if the Wall Street Journal op-ed link could be shared. It is, in fact, in the chat box right now. So if you want to take that out of the chat box and share it widely, we would appreciate that. The other thing I wanted to just talk about briefly before we move on to questions, and I am going to exercise my prerogative to ask the first one, is that there's another resource that you all might be interested in. There's a blog post up now on the Philanthropy Roundtable site that talks about the debate over private foundation payout, which comes up with both the patriotic millionaires and also the Arnold Madoff proposal. If you are interested in that topic, it talks about that resource has within it two other resources, a link to a very thoughtful series of articles in something of a debate that was sponsored by the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and also a lot of information on a 2020 report that was commissioned by the Council of Michigan Foundations around foundation payout over a long period of time that shows the detrimental effects of raising payout, even in the short term, on long-term spending power. So as you begin to balance the future and the present, I think it's great for everyone to have that kind of data. And again, that link is now also in the chat box. So let's start with Q&A, and I am going to ask the first question. I'm going to start with Sandra. Sandra, Christina provided some details about the Arnold Madoff proposed legislation. And I'm wondering, since you engage so much with other philanthropy serving organizations, what you're hearing from the sector and from your colleagues in the sector about that.
Thank you. Question. I think that there's a lot of controversy about the proposal. And I think that the more organizations dig into it, the more donors dig into it, the more questions that are raised. They are struggling with the carrot approach and the stick approach that's embedded in these proposals. And so, I think it's fair to say that there hasn't been much uptake of the proposal. It's not resonating probably as much as the authors had hoped it was going to resonate. And I would expect the same and to continue moving forward. I think the criticisms that I've heard is that the carrots seem to be on the foundation side, broadening options for foundations, and the sticks tend to be on the donor advised fund side, narrowing options for donor advised funds, which are increasingly popular tool with middle income folks and not uber wealthy folks. I think the other concern I heard was it seems like the supporters are large, well financed, well capitalized, well staffed organizations that will likely be able to accommodate these changes in the proposal, whereas the smaller guys won't be able to. It is a fragile ecosystem, and loading additional challenges on top could prove are ill-advised. I think those are some of the reactions I've heard, but again, there hasn't been a tremendous or even a real meaningful uptake.
Thank you. We've got a question from our audience that starts out and says, hey there, seems like some of the proposals our field would be concerned about, like many of the DAF reforms or changes to anonymity that the Roundtable is very focused on, would be bird droppings. And I want to be clear, bird there is spelled B-Y-R-D, droppings, and not meet the standard for reconciliation. What's your assessment of that? So someone who is a much better authority on congressional operations than me needs to answer that question.
I always love a good
Sandra?
insider joke. There are very strict rules about what is and is not allowed under reconciliation and how the process proceeds. Um, and a chief among them is that there needs to be a budgetary component. And so if we've got a regulatory reform that doesn't have a clear cost, that can affect whether or not it's considered allowable under a reconciliation process. That being said, we're taking nothing for granted and we'll be watching everything very closely.
Thank you. Okay. Nonprofits receive far more money in government grants and contracts than they do from donations. A large portion of these funds comes through the Department of Health and Human Services, which Javier Becerra will head. Do you anticipate using these grants and contracts to affect how nonprofits operate, such as who sits on their boards? The Department of Education has used its programs, such as Pell Grants, to enforce various federal civil rights policies.
I'll take it. I think it's a great question. I think it absolutely could. I think, for those of us who were watching the Biden nominations and waiting for who was going to be named Attorney General, there was a little bit sigh of relief when Javier Becerra went to HHS. And so, we're going to be watching to see whether some of the history that he's had in Congress and as California Attorney General kind of follows him over there. The question, and I think it's worth posing to a lawyer or someone who studies this, is in the case of Pell Grants, there were federal civil rights laws already on the books that the contracts would require compliance with. There are no laws on the books that talk about who should sit on boards or what your grantee should look like. And so it's curious. It's a curious question for me whether or not the contracts would require it. I will say that the House passed, I want to say it's about a year ago, that a bill that would have required on the corporate side disclosure of demographics for boards. This follows a bill that was passed in California and Washington State and some other places. So it's not to say that that bill won't be passed and then it couldn't be enforced in a contract. It just seems to me that would be the logical order.
Thanks, Christy. And again, I want to encourage folks to ask questions by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. I'm not going to be reading names, so be comfortable asking anything you'd like. We've got another one here. How did the decisions of the big tech companies to censure conservative groups affect philanthropy?
I'll take it. I don't think the Roundtable has an official position on big tech, but I will say that some of these investigations against the heinous things that happened at the Capitol last Wednesday will bring in groups that you would not expect to be there. And we see this a lot with other groups trying to label some nonprofits as good and some nonprofits as bad based on their mission or their guiding principles. So yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be an issue in the future and something that, groups on the left and the right, I think should be concerned at this point.
Thanks, Christy. Another question here. I noticed that the Arnold Madoff Initiative is now running ads on the Chronicle of Philanthropy website. Are a similar set of counterpoint ads in the works to tell the other side of the story?
I'd love to see them. I haven't seen the ads on the Chronicle yet. So perhaps a few more ad dollars would get them to my computer.
I think we've got another one here too. Yes. Can someone speak more about the push to increase the 5% payout on private foundations? Do you think this issue is going to get entirely swept into the issues with daft secrecy and alleged hoarding of funds? Sandra, would you like to speak to that?
So I'll kick it off, but then Joanne, I'm going to put it back on you because you are quite the expert in that area. And I'll just say that the past year, there's been appetite in Congress to explore the issue of payout and payout parity, either raising foundation payouts or creating donor-advised fund payouts. And do you make it equal to foundations? Do you make it somewhat higher or lower? And I think what's driving that is, first off, a lack of understanding that 5% is not arbitrary. right? It is a purposeful number that's been in law for a very long period of time based upon average returns. And in fact, 5% may be just a little too high based on historical returns. And so I think we have our work cut out for us to help members understand why it's 5% and if it would and if it would increase, how that would impact long-term giving. So yes, I think there's appetite, but I also think there's plenty of room for and plenty of openness for education of these members. I know, Joanne, you've done a lot of work in this area.
Yeah, so I guess I'll talk a little bit about that report that was commissioned by the Council of Michigan Foundations, which did some long-term projections and used 7% payout and 10% payout. And those were numbers that were not chosen out of thin air. 7% is the number in the Arnold Madoff proposal, where it's not a stick, as Sandra said, it's a carrot. But 10% is the number in the Patriotic Millionaires proposal. And so that was to mandate that private foundations and donor advised funds increase payout to 10% over a 3-year period. I think the advantage of having a report like the one CMF commissioned is that by projecting market returns over a significant period of time, what they showed is that at 7%, you potentially lose your giving power for a period of 10 years. And if you go up to 10%, it's 2 decades. So for foundations, and it's not simply about the need or the desire to exist in perpetuity, but really about mission. For foundations that are working on missions that require extensive resources over a long period of time, climate change is an obvious one, poverty is one, substance abuse is another one. There may be less desire to increase that payout rate very much because you are penalizing the future and you are penalizing those who will need those resources in the future. And that's why, again, I would also refer people to that. It's just a great set of pieces on the Stanford Social Innovation Review because they're coming at it from a wide variety of backgrounds and make some interesting comments about, is it really about the dollars or is it about the impact of the dollars? Is it really about the dollars or the efficiency with which those dollars are allocated? So I encourage lots of people to read about foundation payout. I think it does seem like an esoteric topic that only the CFOs of private foundations are monitoring, but I think we all know that it can have that foundation funding can have a transformative effect. Okay, we got a few more questions. So, okay, the issue of Arnold Madoff reforms is not exclusively a Republican Democratic issue in addition to donor privacy. Which members, R&D, will be important to our side? And are there bad R's on the issue with which to be concerned? And in parentheses, we already know the bad D's.
There are no bad members of Congress, right? We can talk to everybody. So the committees of jurisdiction obviously matter. So Senate Finance, House Ways and Means, and of course, leadership who control what's happening on the floor, priorities, and so forth. And the initial reaction we're getting from folks and talking to people is there are enough headaches out there in the world right now. They don't really want a headache in the form of a charitable sector that is frustrated and distracted and so forth. So I would say that the general approach right now is do no harm. Don't get in the way of people sending more dollars out the door to help folks. Don't disrupt what's working. There are other bigger fish to fry when it comes to congressional priorities. So I would say if you're looking at a list, look at leadership, look at committees of jurisdiction, Senate Finance, House Ways and Means, and those are going to be the folks who matter a lot.
Christy, one has popped up for you. Can you talk a bit about donor privacy in the states?
Yes, so I sounded the alarm on donor disclosure, which I mentioned is an R and a D issue. It's a D issue from the kind of the common cause wing of the Democratic Party, who wants to, end dark money in elections and such. And on the Republican side, it's usually the argument goes something like this. An elected official says, "Hey, I just had my primary, and someone sent mail in my district, and I want to know who's behind the postcards that said bad things about me." And so you have this kind of odd alliance on between the right and the left for donor disclosure. But interestingly, and if you've seen the Roundtable's programming, you've heard me talk about this before, there's also a strange bedfellow in favor of donor privacy. In fact, there are a number of states that are considering donor privacy bills this year. I think the Iowa bills just dropped today. And you get to see who signs up in favor of the bills. And I believe I saw the ACLU and One Iowa, which is an LGBT group, both signed up in favor of the Iowa donor privacy bill. So we're going to start to see this a lot around the country. We're also, we might start to see some regulatory action happen on donor privacy from attorneys general and from governors. And I wouldn't be surprised if we also see some ballot measures on donor privacy at some point. Certainly been a successful tactic of those who want more donor disclosure. We saw I think it was Amendment 2 in Alaska, and a donor disclosure piece, ballot measure in Oregon pass in the 2020 election cycle. So I think we'll continue to see more on the ballot. And, listen, the good news is that there is a strong coalition in place to push donor privacy measures across the states. And I think that is not only good for the states, but that's an excellent narrative to tell members of Congress when they want to know what's going on back home.
Thanks, Christy. So sticking with the states for a bit here, Sandra, could you talk a little bit about potential donor advice fund legislation in the states and where that stands?
Sure. So last year we saw legislation pop up in California, and we know that there's a similar effort underway in Minnesota, and there may even be efforts kind of brewing in other states led by New York. So whereas last year the measure was defeated largely because they just ran out of time and COVID became a really big topic. We didn't necessarily win because it didn't get pulled because we won substantively. They just ran out of time. We'd expect similar legislation to be reintroduced this session. I think the good news is that there are plenty of organizations in California on all sides of the aisle, all types of organizations that think it went too far, and that we're partnering with. And we will do similarly in Minnesota and New York and elsewhere. But Christy, you're our state maven. You want to weigh in here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things to keep in mind. One, you have this narrative around donor advised funds happening at the federal levels that informs big, full-time year-round legislatures like California and New York and Illinois and Michigan and other places. Second, and if you watch the introduction of state legislation, you always see more bills introduced right after the election year and more movement on bills happen the year after the election year. So I think we're going to see a big uptick in not only the number of bills, but also regulatory measures. The Minnesota Council on Foundations had a paper on donor advised funds that talked about that supervisory gap around DAFs, and I'm curious to see if the Attorney General is going to take them up on the idea. We're watching. We're always watching. We are looking to see what threats emerge at the state level, and we'll be there to push back.
Thanks. We've got about 13 or 14 minutes left and time for quite a few more questions. So please go ahead and add them to the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. I'm gonna pop in with one too. We're always encouraging folks, individual donors, foundation leaders and staff to get in touch with their legislators, make their operations known, explain what they're doing in their communities or for their missions. I've talked to quite a few people this year who have sort of set that aside because in the absence of personal meetings, they feel that they're really not going to accomplish anything. But I know that you've all stayed active throughout 2020 and into 2021. So Christina, would you talk a little bit about kind of what that atmosphere is like now when you're on calls or Zoom calls and how productive it is, and maybe just reinforce the value of continuing to get in touch with your representatives?
Yeah, the irony is that it's actually easier to connect than ever before, because prior there was this bias towards, I'm going to go to the Capitol and have an in-person meeting. And obviously there's logistics of getting yourself there and getting into the building and connecting for 5 minutes. Now a lot of things are happening on Zoom calls. Congressional staffers are, working from home off of Zoom. So whereas before you might find yourself running from one corner to the Capitol to the other, and now you can just flip between Zooms and you're having more than before. So folks are busy, and so you want to be respectful of their time. But really, of course, when you're connecting with them, you're alerting them what's happening in the life of their constituents, but also giving them stories that they can turn around and use in the context of their boss's priorities and legislation and progress that they want to see advance. So I would argue that you're not a burden on them. You're actually doing them a favor by illuminating what's really happening out there in the real world. And if you can connect the dots back to this is how policy changes lives, you've got a twofer there.
Thank you.
Hey, Joanne, can I jump? Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, Sandra. Go ahead.
I just want to jump in. I agree with Christina 100%. I'd also note that this is a new Congress with lots of new members. And we would be remiss. It would be a shame if we didn't take the opportunity to get to know particularly these new members who are coming in with a blank slate, not a blank mind, but a blank slate on policy issues, and try to give them a better understanding of not just charity, but philanthropy. Most members, they understand charity, but they may not understand philanthropy and what drives philanthropy. So again, I just put a plug in particularly for all those new members.
And if I can add to a couple of things. One is, I think people run for elected office because they want to make the world a better place. And, sometimes when you send a message or you call and you don't get a return call back, it's because they've got a million other things going on. Everyone is competing for the same 535 members of Congress and 100 members of a state legislature. So I think frequency is really important. The game in Washington is to always keep your issue, at the top of the pile for members of Congress. And so don't be shy in reaching out a number of times. And this goes for state level lawmakers as well. They're in session for a period of time and they're home for a period of time. I like to go see people in their districts. I like to go meet them and meet them where they are. And I think it's a little less hectic and a little more of a time when you can really talk about the issues that matter to you. And so know that if you only get a couple of minutes now because they're in, try and find when they're out to have those larger and more meaningful conversations.
Christy, stay right where you are. We've got one folks who want to know, let's see, that you mentioned 20 states looking at donor disclosure issues. Is there a list of the 20 states somewhere so that we can know which states are looking at it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple of things to keep in mind. One, a lot of times at the state level, the donor disclosure measures are written so broadly that it is impossible to know whether this is an issue for just 501c4s or C6s, or if it claws in C3s. So anything that you want to, any state that you want to look at, you'll want to read the bill carefully to make sure. We released a white paper at the Roundtable a number of years ago. I think there was a bill in New Mexico that would have called electioneering a preacher at a pulpit, a certain number of days before the election, who mentions a candidate in the sermon. So we're seeing this broadening of what it means to be electioneering into things that 501c3s can do every day. A really good resource for all of this is the Institute for Free Speech. They are designed as an organization to talk about free speech issues, and they have a special interest in donor privacy. I think it's ifs.org, and you can find lots of information, both at the state level on donor disclosure, but also they've done a lot of work on HR1.
Right. We've got a very broad question here. What ultimately seems to motivate the critics of philanthropy? Is it that they want to see the dollars ultimately directed toward other agendas? This is open to anyone who wants to comment.
I will not put on the mute button and say something quick, and then maybe Christina and Sandra want to jump in as well. I think it is clear that the goal of all of these kinds of proposals that attack philanthropy is to do two things. One is to force money into the public square, and once the money is in the public square, to campaign or harass or bully. I mean, it runs the spectrum of the actions that folks will take to make sure those dollars go to preferred groups and preferred causes. We've seen this at the shareholder level with corporate giving, and it seems like the same thing is happening with private philanthropy. Great question.
Yeah, I would say this isn't always the case, but often is that there is an attitude of being open to using government to force other people to follow your preferences. So I have an opinion, therefore everyone should have an opinion, therefore I'm going to use government to make it happen. I think a lot of folks, for example, would want to see charitable giving accelerated. Who wouldn't, right? But by what means and through which forces and at what expense? And I've definitely seen that permeate some of the attitudes, especially at this Congress as it gets started.
All right, we've got a question here. In 2017, the tax bill reduced the number of taxpayers who could take the charitable deduction. And because of that, the growth in charitable giving slowed for a couple of years before ticking back up this year. I think that means 2020, amid the pandemic and the new universal charitable deduction. Can you shed some light on how some of the proposed policies you've discussed today could have similar effects on charitable giving or grant making? Some of the comments have suggested it could hurt future grant making, but it also seems like it could slow giving in real time. So the question is about slowing current grant making. Sandra, do you want, there's talk about a new cap on the charitable deduction, I believe.
So this is about charitable giving and incentivizing charitable giving. Congress has passed in the recent future measures that would allow everyone in the U.S. To take a charitable deduction and not have their gifts taxed. And I think that we may see additional efforts this year in Congress to even further expand that as a way to democratize philanthropy and democratize giving, right? What we know about giving is that it goes to a diversity of causes. And I think that Congress recognizes that. And so that's why I think we're going to see many more efforts aimed at trying to expand the number of people, not narrow like some of these reform proposals would do, but expand the number of givers to charity. And I think that's why we feel so passionately about some of these reform proposals that would make it more difficult or annoying to actually give away your money. We should be in the business of encouraging people to give away their money and celebrating that, not finding ways to hit them over the head because they're not doing it in a certain manner.
I think it's a great question, and I apologize for pausing. I was trying to reread it to make sure I got all of it. So on the donor privacy front, donor disclosure would chill charitable giving now and in the future. And I don't often recommend reading amicus briefs for fun, but if you are interested, the Roundtable's amicus brief on the current case of the Supreme Court is actually really great. And one of the things that we talk about there is the role of anonymous charitable giving with controversial causes. And it mentions women's suffrage and civil rights. I think for a time, the majority of the LGBT rights cause was funded with anonymous charitable donations. And so if you want to preserve the next controversial cause and fund it and see it grow, then you'll want to preserve donor privacy. Absolutely.
We've got a question about the proposal around family foundations and Arnold Madoff. And it's, what are the potential long-term implications of not allowing family, staff, and board members' salaries and expenses to count toward payout? Why should we be concerned? I'm going to jump in on that one. I think the concerns there are several concerns. One, there is already protection in the law against unreasonable and unnecessary uses of family members and family foundations. It's a clause that applies to both family members and non-family members, salaries that are neither reasonable or positions that are not necessary. The other issue is that it creates a class of individuals who are being subjected to a rule without any obvious reason. They are doing the same job as members of people who are not members of the family. And the third reason is that we sort of see this as the beginning of some potentially other threats on family foundations, which exist in many cases because people are trying to protect donor intent and trying to pass a legacy of generosity down through generations of family members. But we have seen family members under attack before. And frankly, I think that's the concern, is that while this may involve a small number of dollars, its potential for abuse is magnified 100-fold if it passes, because it just opens the door to something more serious.
If I can add to that too, Joanne, I think it's indicative of a larger effort to somehow determine what is a good board member, what is a bad board member, what is a good organization to fund, and what is not a good organization to fund, based on criteria that could have nothing to do with mission or guiding principles or donor intent. And I worry that in the charitable sector, we're going down this road when we should be celebrating the diversity within philanthropy. We want a lot of different charitable organizations all doing their own thing to contribute to the fabric of our society. And to try to have this caste system and some good, some bad, I think harms that.
We're gonna go over time just a bit here. We've got Ray Madoff, who would like to share some information and make a few comments.
Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you for the program and for including us in it. I just want to say that there was a question about what motivates us in our work, and I just want you to know that what motivates us is what motivates you, which is a desire for stronger philanthropy. And our concern is that certain rules that exist now will ultimately serve to undermine philanthropy in the eyes of the public. And that's why we promote rules, for example, about like that you can't meet payout by giving to a donor advised fund. If the Philanthropy Roundtable or others feels that we should repeal the 5% payout rule, then we should repeal the 5% payout rule. But it undermines the strength and validity of the sector if we have a rule, we say we embrace a payout rule, but then we render it utterly meaningless. So I just wanted to express that what we want is what you want. We want a strong philanthropic sector, and we think that the more legitimate the rules are, the stronger the sector is when the public looks at them. So anyway, I want to thank you for the program, and I want to thank you for including me in the conversation.
Thank you, Ray. I do want to be clear, though, that the Philanthropy Roundtable is not calling for any change in the 5% rule or repealing it in any way. We have always argued that the existing charitable laws are purposeful, that they should be upheld, and that we stand by them, but that additional lawmaking could be, in certain areas, could be very harmful to philanthropy. So with that, I am going to close because we're a few minutes over, but I want to thank everyone again. I'm sorry for folks who are asking questions at the last minute. We're not going to be able to get to them. I hope that we can convene again at some point, not too far in the future. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Thank you for everything you're doing for philanthropy, for the communities that you serve, and for the United States. Everybody, have a great day.